Okay, here we go. Let's find out what you noticed, what you found out about each of the theories. So we're going to begin here with force theory. And as we talk through these, I would recommend that you write down some thoughts if they differ from what you already have. So who would like to venture your summary of the force theory and see if you are on task or on board with where we should be with force theory? Made confident enough in your group? Josh?
A group that takes control of land by war and force.
Good. Okay. Force kind of gives it away, but it's where a group, could be an individual, that is going to take over the government, and they are going to rule it whether you consent or not. So how do you get rid of somebody like that? You force them out. Okay, you live under the force theory, so you got to come up with a stronger army to get rid of the guy that's in control. Anybody think of an example? ISIS, very good. Yeah, ISIS be a force under the force theory. So in order to displace ISIS, you're not going to vote them out by a democratic election, are you? It's not going to work. You've got to come in there with military force, and you have to get them to surrender. You have to get them to move out. So great example. So any question on the force theory? Good. We look back to Thucydides. Remember him? World history. Greek writer. Okay. He writes about the force theory, even though it wasn't necessarily called that back then. The strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. That explains the force theory right there. If you're weak, you get no choice. You just deal with it. And it helps us to better understand some of the ancient cultures when they would get overthrown or somebody else would come in there and conquer their land. Why they just say, okay, we're just sending our tax check to another address. We don't really care who conquers us as long as we continue to live peaceably. So that explains the force theory. Let's talk next about evolutionary theory. Let me hear from a different group. How'd you summarize that, Dave?
The model of a family, which traditionally has one head that makes final decisions, was used as a standard for the original government.
Good. So tribal government or family government would often fit into this, where you have those families that rule a group of people, and as that group of people grows, that family remains in control. And power is continually passed down from one generation to the next from the family patriarch, which it was generally male, but there were some cultures where the female was the ruler, especially African cultures. And so they would pass that down to the oldest or the most qualified individual in the family. And so when we're looking at evolutionary theory, they claim that modern governments come out of that same idea. Well, clearly this would lean a little bit more toward the monarchies that we have seen as opposed to democracy. Okay. So, any question on evolutionary theory? I have a quote by Aristotle. He said, "The first thing to arise is the family. When several families are united, the first society to be formed is called the village. When several villages are united in a single complete community, the state comes into existence. So hence it is evident that the state is a creation of nature, and the man by nature is a political animal." I don't know if I would necessarily go that far, but he does help us to explain how this particular theory of government may have come to be. Now, let's move on to the next one. We have divine right theory. Anybody care to venture a guess on this one? I should say educated guess, not a total guess out of the clouds. What's the divine right theory all about? I've already heard from this group. We had other groups. I already heard from your group, didn't I? Yeah, I don't want to hear from your group. Awesome.
God created the state and that God had given right to the
Okay, so God had directly given the power to those that have been chosen in power. Again, this one, like the force theory, it makes sense when you think about the name, divine right. So God is the one who appoints the leaders. So what happens if you don't think they should be leader anymore? You what? Yeah, you got to take it up with God, don't you? And how would this prove to be an advantage if you were in power? Exactly. Well, God told me to be in power. So how are you going to question God? You guys remember studying the Middle Ages and some of the power struggle between the Pope and the kings in the Middle Ages? I love that period of history because there's so much political gaming that's going on between the two, where the Pope says, God didn't appoint you, and the king says, no, yeah, divine right, yeah, he did. You don't know what you're talking about. And the Pope says, no, I'm more powerful than you because I am God's divinely appointed communicator here on earth. And the king says, well, God appointed me to be king, and I'm king over you because you're a citizen of my... And it was just back and forth. It's entertaining. Like, they could make a sitcom or an entire drama series out of the middle-aged Pope, king debate going back and forth. Did they really? Oh, if somebody does that. Hey, we have a film class now, don't we?
Yeah.
Any of you in that? Pitch that idea. There you go. No, maybe not. Maybe it's a little bit more than we want to handle. So divine right theory. I think we can even go back here to 1 Samuel. Samuel said to the people, do you see him whom the Lord has chosen, that there is no one like him among all the people? And so all the people shouted and said, long live the king. Who's he talking about? What king? Heard somebody kind of mumble it. Saul, yeah. Talk about Saul. And God had appointed Saul. And I don't think we would dispute that. God took Samuel and he said, this is my man that I have chosen. Saul was divinely appointed. And God did appoint certain men to lead the nation of Israel. This is the origin of the divine right idea. It comes from Israel in the Old Testament. But many of the more modern cultures have adopted that and probably came from some king somewhere that said, I think that God appointed me, and so you need to bow down to me and you need to obey me. Last one is the social contract theory, perhaps the most important of all of them, and maybe the most complicated. So, anybody have a quick summary or a thought that may go along with that?
So what we talked about was how like Trump and them are trying to decide about the healthcare issues and how he wants our support in the healthcare.
Okay.
I see that kind of with the social contract theory, because they want our support for our well-being.
Okay.
They're trying to promote our well-being with the healthcare.
Okay. Yeah, those are really good thoughts, and they do fit in with the social contract theory idea. Does anybody else have something to add to that you talked about within your group? Max?
Like a group of people can give power to a government or establish that government and give them power to help them benefit that population they give them.
Good. So a key idea here in the social contract theory is, as Morgan was talking about, some give and take. There is compromise because, as Max pointed out, the power comes from the people and is given to the political leaders. There is no divine appointment here. There is no force theory. Nobody's forcing anybody to obey the laws. Nobody is passing their power down from family to family like we saw in the evolutionary theory. But we have this social contract where the government leaders say that if you give us the power, we will use that power for your benefit and for your good. That is our contract with you. And if we break that contract, you have every power to remove us from office. So it's a lot of times unwritten. In the United States, it is written. It's called the Constitution. But there are, even within the Constitution, there's a lot of unwritten ideas that people often debate. Is this part of the social contract theory or not? But it's key to understand that people are the sole source of the political power in the social contract theory. And the government only exists as long as the people support the government. What danger signs do you see in our country right now? When you understand how our United States is social contract. So what danger signs do you see out there as potentially harmful?
People are trying to
Mm-hmm. Yes. What else?
And there's a lot of different views, so people are going to try to get the government to side with them.
Okay. We'll talk a little bit later about majority versus minority rule. And I don't remember if it was this class or it was the other government. I talked about how Donald Trump won the election, but he didn't necessarily have the majority of the United States behind him. And I think that's also proving true right now, where he does not have a majority of support in the United States. There's a lot of division. Now he's still our president, and he still needs to be respected, and I will always promote that in this class. But as far as our nation goes, we are, in essence, tearing ourselves apart from within. And I don't want to make any kind of prophecy or scare anybody into moving to Canada. But from a lot of the biblical study that I've heard under some good preachers, there's no reference in any of the Bible prophecy of the end times to a nation that could be the United States. Now, maybe it's just we're missing it, but my gut feeling, and this is totally my opinion, so take it just as that, is that the United States is not going to crumble and fall from outside. We're going to crumble and fall from within. That we're not going to have some nation come in and invade us and attack us that is going to conquer us. We are going to tear ourselves apart because of division, because of being opinionated and unwilling to compromise. That's just for free. All right, that's just my opinion. Whether you ask for it or not, there it is. But if the social contract falls apart, then we no longer have our government as we know it. If the people fail to support the government, and if the government fails to continue to support the ideas of the people, then both sides are going to rip up the contract and say, this is not worth it, we're done. So this was originally designed by Thomas Hobbes, James Harrington, John Locke, and Rousseau. These guys were some of the writers that their philosophies were merged together and were brought together to make the social contract theory. Now, in test, I'm not going to ask you to list all those guys, but they might show up in a question. What theory did Rousseau, John Locke, Hobbes, Harrington promote? Questions such as that. So you need to be able to recognize and associate them with the social contract theory. But I will not ask you to list them, so you're not going to have to memorize those names. Just a little FYI there. Now, within the social contract theory, we see a lot of concepts that are similar to the democracy that we are familiar with. Ideas like popular sovereignty. Anybody care to help me out with that term? What is popular sovereignty? I guarantee you talked about this in U.S. history, especially when it came to Civil War and slavery. You may not remember if I know you did. Popular references the people, the population. Sovereignty is their will to decide. Yeah. So the people get to decide their own governmental decisions. They get to decide the direction of our country. So the power lies in the people. It's important that you understand that term. Popular sovereignty is the power lies within the people. Limited government and individual rights. So the individual rights of the people always supersede, are more important than the rights of the government and the political officials. And it is their job to look out for our well-being. Now, that is part of where we get the debate right now in current politics. Some people believe that our current administration is not doing that to the best interest of the American people. I'm not going to sit here and debate that with you right now. From the words of John Locke, the only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst another, in a secure enjoyment of their properties and greater security against any that are not of it. So what he's saying there is that the only way that this works is if we all agree to put aside our individual rights and liberties, put them together in a big pool, and we're all going to support this social contract. When that fails to happen, when everybody decides that I'm going to do my own thing, I have my own ideas, it will fall apart. And that is my greatest fear for our nation. So, as we look at the powers of government, so the power is the idea that you have the ability to make other people act according to your own will or do what you tell them to do. So, how do I maintain power in this classroom? Why are you all sitting so intently, quietly? Why are you participating in class?
You like you're scary.
I'm scary. Good answer. I like that. I doubt that that's true. Why else are you sitting here voluntarily instead of, out on the lake somewhere or? Okay, you have the threat of the authorities coming after you. Okay, why else? Okay, so you're willing to submit to my authority in order to gain knowledge and information, to better yourself in life. Good. So there's lots of different ways, and it depends on your perspective. Some of you, mom and dad made you come here. Some of you, you're here because you want to get a high school degree, and this is a requirement for that. Some of you are here because you don't know why, you're just here, and they gave you a schedule and said you've got to show up. But governments can't always work that way. I mean, we saw in the force theory, maybe they can force people to by gunpoint, but we need to understand where the source of our government's power comes from. And as we look at the way that they force or coerce people into falling in line, can come a number of different ways. So their source of power can come through coercion. They use threat or violence to force people to do what they want them to do. I hope that I will never use violence in this classroom. I can't promise not to use a threat. Because if you don't show up to class, you don't do the work, you're not going to pass. So if you want to take that as a threat, then I suppose you can. But I will do my best to avoid violence. I've never used it, so I don't anticipate using violence for this class. The second way is through wealth. You can often influence your way to power through wealth. We're not going to name any names, but some have accused certain presidents of using their wealth in order to become president. I'm reading a book right now on George H.W. Bush. It's written by George W. Bush. And have any of you read that one? I'm only a couple chapters into it, but it's pretty interesting to see how their family built their wealth. And I never realized the process that they went through. And George W. Bush, our president of 8 years, talks about how when he was growing up as a child, he lived in such a poor town that he lived in one of the few houses that had an indoor bathroom. And most of the homes in this town still had outhouses, and their bathroom did come with a cost because they had to share it with the two ladies that lived next door. And so they had an attached duplex apparently, and they had one bathroom that they shared. So he said that was a little awkward. But they did gain a whole bunch of wealth. I'm interested to read and find out exactly how that all pans out. So social pressure can be another way that governments gain power. So they get certain people within the population to get on board with what the government's trying to do, and then they try to have rallies and they try to get everybody else to fall in line with what this smaller group is trying to do. On the CNN 10 that we watched on Monday, did they talk about Venezuela? Or was that yesterday? Must have been yesterday. Okay, so Venezuela is a good example of this. When their previous dictator came to power, he came in with all kinds of socialist ideas, and He gave people free apartments. He gave them free TVs. He gave them free money, all kinds of stuff. And they loved him. And so the people that got the stuff put pressure on the people that didn't get the stuff to vote for this guy and keep him in power. Well, he died a little while ago, and one of Venezuela's main exports is oil, and oil prices have dropped. And now that he's gone, all the TVs have broken, and the apartments have now become dilapidated. People are out of jobs, out of money, and they're asking the government for more stuff. And now it's starting to fall apart because the social pressure is no longer there to support the existing government. So they're really battling that, and that's why social pressure is not always the greatest way to go. I have a little bit of a conflict of ideas of whether or not I think that Twitter is a good idea for a politician. Again, not naming any names here, but sometimes I think it could be used for good or evil. So anyway, the way that we see that executed, the evidence of that power is that the people voluntarily do things to participate in the government, whether that is paying taxes, serve in the military, vote. All those things are part of the way that we see that one of those sources is working. This year is an off-election year because it is an odd year. There are still elections in November. There typically are. How many of you will be 18 by the second week of November? Okay. So a few of you will have the opportunity to vote, and we'll have to find out, and I'll do some digging here to find out what is on the ballot here. But even in non-presidential years, non-congressional years, there are still typically local people to vote for, and so it's important that we do that. I will get on that soapbox again, and I'll continue to preach voting. So legitimacy of power, when we see these type of governments put into place, there are ways that we can look at them and we can say, yes, that's a good way to rule. That's not necessarily the best way to rule. Traditionally, and traditional legitimacy looks like this. People continue to respect that power. They continue to respect the leadership because that's what they've been trained to do. They've been trained to respect the president or respect the prime minister, respect the dictator, whoever it may be. And so they accept the powers that are placed on them, or they accept the demands of the government based on tradition. So you pay taxes out of your paycheck for the job that you had this summer because why? Because everybody pays taxes. Okay, that is, if you have that mindset, then it is a traditional mindset of, well, everybody else pays it, so I need to pay it too. My parents had to pay taxes on their job when they got their money, and so I do as well. Now, some may take a more charismatic view, and some people recognize the government's power because of the charisma of the leader. So they really love the person or the people in charge, and because of that, they're willing to do whatever the government says. Adolf Hitler, to me, is one of the prime examples of this. As much as we know about him now, when he was being elected and rising to power, the people actually voted for him. They voted him into power. They said, yeah, we like this guy. He's going to save Germany. He's going to bring Germany back to the forefront. And he did. He also did a lot of bad things. On the other end of the spectrum, please do not twist my words here, but on the other end of the spectrum, Bill Clinton also has that charisma. Now, please don't make any connection to Adolf Hitler and Bill Clinton other than the charisma. Okay, I don't want somebody walking out of here saying, well, Bill Clinton and Hitler are like the same guy. No, they're not. But Bill Clinton, from things that I've read and people that I've heard interviews from, Bill Clinton walks in a room and he has this presence that everybody in the room feels like they have met Bill Clinton, even if they are 100 feet away and never get close to him. Just because of the way that he conducts himself and the charisma that he possesses. Part of the reason why he got elected twice to the presidency. And so people follow a leader because of that. Thirdly, we have rational legitimacy. And this is probably the best reason to fall in line and to respect the government's rules, is that you follow it because you believe that the government has your best interest in mind. And so to support the government, you are going to follow their rules. You're going to do what they say. This would really go in line with the social contract theory. So you pay your taxes because you know this is going to help out the good of everybody. You vote because it's going to help everybody. You participate in government because it's going to help everybody. It is a rational mindset to recognize the government. Machiavelli. His approach was, let's force the people into obedience. It's much safer to be feared than loved. And in some cases, that can be true. And for those of you that are here because you fear me, because I'm scary, okay, I'll take it. I don't know that you're really being truthful there. But I got a couple types of power here, and then we will close down for today. So within the United States, we see this specifically where there are three basic kinds of power. There's a legislative power. Now, we specifically have three branches of government to handle each of these parts of the power. Not every country operates that way. Some nations, some states will put all three into one. Some will put two into a head of state, and they will have a third one that's separate. So at some point, they figure out a way to include this in their government. So legislative is the ability to make laws. So somewhere, some entity, whether it's a dictator, whether it's a parliament, whether it's a Congress, they are going to make the laws for the nation. They also have an executive power. So who's our executive in the United States? It's Donald Trump, it's our president. Okay, he is the one, he has the ability and the power here to execute and enforce the laws. Okay, execute and enforce the laws is the power of the executive. So execute, executive, those go together. Let's associate that when it comes to our laws. And so if we had to summarize his job, that is primarily it, to execute the laws. And according to the Constitution, he has a variety of ways in which he can do that. And then thirdly, we have judicial. What's their main job? To interpret. It has come to be revising, but really their job is to interpret the law. And the judicial branch in and of itself has kind of become the monster nobody can control because of the fact that they have learned that they can revise laws even though that's not their constitutional power. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about judicial branch. Let me leave you with this here. James Madison says in Federalist 47, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Very much arguing for a separation of powers here, that part of the reason why we set up our government the way we did was because of the ideas of James Madison, where he said that if all of these are in the hands of the same group of people, it's going to get out of control. And part of the reason why we see so many arguments the way that we do is because they believe that one branch of the government has extended over into another one without the proper check system.